Thank you for coming out today. My name is Betty Schenkel. I am the manager of the Archives Local History and Genealogy Unit here at the Central Library. I'm also the official archivist for the City of Fort Worth. So keep that in mind when you have donations of historical photographs or Swartz memorabilia. We are creating a Swartz collection, and everything that you donate will be helpful in expanding that collection. If you live here in Fort Worth and have not gotten your Fort Worth Library card, we encourage you to do that today. Also to come down and visit us in the unit. We're on the lower level, the far west end. And I just welcome you and thank you for coming out. Right now I'm going to turn it over to one of the exhibit curators for the Swartz exhibit, and that is Dr. Rick Seltzer.
Can you hear me out there? Okay. You know the old joke about the guy that stood up and said, "Is there anybody who can't hear me?" And the back row held their hands up, and the front row got up and moved to the back row. So I just wanted to be sure. What a long, strange journey this has been. As she calls herself, my partner in crime, my collaborator, Donna Donnell, and I came up with this idea, started talking about it 7 months ago. And in the beginning, a lot of people said, this is a harebrained scheme, you'll never be able to pull it off, you'll never be able to get the money, just this and that and this and that and the other. And I can't speak for Donna, but I guess I was too stupid to take their word for it that we'd never pull it off. And it's amazing. We got grants from the Eamon Carter Foundation, from the Library Foundation, from the projects, and I can't remember the whole name of the mayor's projects and theme fund, and we provided that. Tuesday night, this past Tuesday, if you weren't aware of it, the mayor proclaimed this Swartz Family Photography Week in Fort Worth and gave us a proclamation on Tuesday night. Last night we had a reception to welcome the family, the Swartz descendants, and they're going to be up here again in a few minutes. Just what a long, strange journey it's been, and that we'll go through today. If you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition, please go see it. If you want to, at the end of today's activities, and we're going to have a reception at the chapel room right behind us when it's over. If you want to get a guided tour of the exhibition, you're welcome to join me. I'll meet outside the chapel room. I'll tell you when, and we'll go down and kind of do a little walking tour. In the meantime, if you have one of the programs, if you don't, be sure to pick one up. But it's part of this long, strange journey. If you have no idea who the Swartzes were, as in the Swartz brothers photographers, and you look at the brochure, it's a beautiful brochure. But if you don't know what the whole thing's about, you go, who knew there were 5 Swartz brothers? And those guys, boy, they're dressed up, but they look a lot like outlaws the way they're sitting there, don't they? So if you got it and looked at it, these aren't the Swartz brothers, but you got to read the small print down underneath. We also have a program out there, so you can tell the players and what inning we're in and all that kind of stuff. There's a program on the table. If you didn't get a program, pick up one on the way out. I'm sure these will be collector's items someday. I'm absolutely sure. At least I'm hoping. I want to turn it now over to Donna. We're kind of on a tight schedule because we want to give our speakers time and we want to have time for several things. I'm going to turn it over to Donna now, Donna Donnell, who has some things. So family, Swartz family, pay attention here.
Well, the journey began for me March 5th, 2009, when I shot an email off to one Tom Williams, who apparently was John Swartz's grandson. So it's been a long 4 years, over 4 years for Tom and I, and this weekend we got to meet each other face to face for the first time. And it has been a whirlwind weekend, hadn't it, Rick? But it's been great. We were asked last night, why do we do this? One reason is because we probably are strange. Why do we devote our time to someone else's family? Well, that's what history's history, but history doesn't stop in the past. History still moves forward into the future, and there is always more to find out about what you thought you already knew. And there was much, much more for us to find out about the Swartz brothers and the Swartz families pertaining to the history and the legacy of Fort Worth, who we are today, the photographs that were left behind, and it was worth the long journey. I want to thank Scott Barker in particular. Scott was there for us. Scott had some of the most wonderful Swartz photographs and majority of ours that are hanging in the gallery are Scott's, because he's got great taste in Swartz photos. But I want to share something with Scott and share it with all of you, how this means so much to people today. On these photographs, if there was a name on the back of the old photograph, I'd get on Ancestry.com or whatever happened and try and find out who that family was, if they were from Fort Worth, and if there were any living descendants. Sometimes I was lucky, most of the time I wasn't. But Scott had a photograph, which is up in our gallery, of the Humphreys brothers. And they are 4 brothers, all with acoustic instruments, and their ages range from about 6 to 11 or 12. Well, I found one of the Humphrey boys' sons, and on Ancestry.com, and I told him that I was aware of the photograph and that we were going to be using it, and he was so excited. He emailed me and he said, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. I knew there was a photograph out there of them that young. Well, it just so happens the Humphreys boys were innovators of early Texas string, which became Texas swing music. They are mentioned in country western music histories, and etc. Well, I don't jump and just send someone else's photograph without asking the holder of it. So I asked Scott if I could send Bob Humphreys the photograph, and I had also asked Bob Humphreys if he could make it for today's event and to meet John Swartz' family, who took the famous photograph of his family. And Scott said, sure, go ahead. So I sent the photograph on to Bob Humphreys, and I got this. This is why we do what we do. This is why, if you're a collector, you openly share things with your community and with other collectors and historians. And so I got this letter from Bob. Actually, I think Bob's wife typed it for him. Hello, Donna. Thank you very much for letting me see the picture. I am blown away. Sorry for the delay in answering my mail. I have been pretty sick now, heart failure, kidney, etc. I would love to make the trip to Fort Worth, but I'm just hoping to get well enough to go before the exhibit is over. I wanted to try and contact some of the descendants of those, but just have been too weak and sick. And so he went down to the bottom and he said, thank you again for letting me view the picture. I really appreciate it, Ron. And I want to thank Scott for being so gracious, because even today, a 100-year-old picture, or really a 120-year-old picture, means a lot to other people today. And so we have someone who's very, very sick. And Scott, I think you just, as he said, blew him away and made his day. And I want to thank you very, very much. On to more moving things. Okay. I would like for Tom Williams, Diane Raleigh to step up to the stage. Tom Williams, can you hear me without being up to the mic? Sure you can. Tom Williams is the grandson of John Swartz. Diane Raleigh is the granddaughter of Charlie Swartz. This weekend was the first time the Swartz family has been together in, what did we say, 112 years or so. This is the first time these cousins have met. Is this not cool or what? It really is. And so, what we have here in honor of of your visit to Fort Worth and to remember this day, and hopefully to pass on to your families, are Swartz photographs.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. And so what we have for Tom, rarely seen and newly found, this is a photograph of Bryant's studio taken in 1936. It's up there. Well, Bryant's studio is what was John Swartz' studio, 705 and a half Main. The hat was on the second floor. The bottom, 705 Main, was Sheehan's Saloon. This is the building where the famous photograph of the Fort Worth Five was taken by John Swartz.
Can you hold it up high so the audience?
I can hold it up high.
Thank you, because that was height for me.
And our theory was that the Wild Bunch stopped in the saloon first downstairs and the wind went up and got the picture taken.
And that is yours.
Thank you
You're
very
so
much. I
welcome.
really appreciate that. That's marvelous. What a beautiful photograph.
And this was 1905, right?
I think so.
And what we have for Charlie's family is, and you were just talking about this today at the cemetery. We were putting a marker, dedicated marker to Charlie at Oakwood Cemetery this morning, and Diane brought up this photograph taken 1905, October 1905, of the fire at the TNP building, and she was just blown away by that. And it just so happened, our presentation to Diane, where I'm thinking the same way, is the Charlie Swartz photograph of the 1905 TNP fire.
Thank you so much. Beautiful.
There's more. There's more.
If I can get Rick to read this and explain it.
For those of you who couldn't be there on Tuesday night, the mayor's proclamation, if you ever get a chance to go over one of the mayor's proclamations, boy, she covers things like, she keeps it moving. This was the proclamation that this is Swartz Brothers Photography Week in Fort Worth. This is the proclamation that Mayor Betsy Price read Tuesday night. Proclamation, Office of the Mayor. Whereas professional photographers David, John, and Charles Swartz are considered to be Fort Worth's first family of photographers, and between the mid-1880s and World War I, they took hundreds of photographs of Fort Worth, its buildings, its people. And whereas the work of the Swartz brothers is the best visual chronicle of turn-of-the-century Fort Worth, particularly its human face as well as the streets, architecture, and events. And whereas the Swartz brothers' photographs are part of the collections of individuals and institutions all over the country, and the current exhibition at the Fort Worth Central Library will be the first time a selection of Swartz images will be on public display in one place. And whereas the Swartz brothers' photographs are part of the historic fabric and the public face of Fort Worth in the form of the famous Wild Bunch photograph, the devastating 1904 fire at the Texas and Pacific Station, the streets, or rather the visit of Theodore Roosevelt, the visit of Quanah Parker, and other notable moments in Fort Worth history. And finally, whereas the city of Fort Worth will encourage all residents to honor the Swartz brothers' legacy and their significant contribution to our city's rich history. Now, therefore, the city of Fort Worth does hereby proclaim May 5th through 11th, 2013 as Swartz Brothers Week.
So what we have for Tom and Diane and also other members of the Swartz family is your copy of the Swartz Brothers Proclamation.
Thank you so much.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. Okay, do y'all have anything
we can go
briefly to
back.
say, or are we good?
We're good.
We're good. All right. Well then,
Thank you.
We want to get on with the really interesting part of this.
It is just, this has just been one great long trip.
We're getting to the serious part of our program, the people who you came to hear speak. A couple of things. This is at some point in here, I'm supposed to thank all the small people who made this possible, who did stuff. It's a cliche because they weren't small people. And there are so many people. They're the people who helped us hang the exhibition. Should have seen us on a Tuesday night with 2 or 3 volunteers and a few Dragoon people in here hanging pictures until they closed the library and threw us out. Just the whole thing. Betty Schenkel, the people who donated the photographs, allowed us to use the photographs. Some of you are here today. This is a point, it's like an Academy Award thing. I should have you all stand up and we should all clap, but we'd be here like on the Academy Awards an extra hour or two. So please just understand, everybody who did, who made this possible, God bless you and thank you. And everybody who's enjoying it, recognize a lot of work by a lot of other people who aren't listed on programs went into this thing. The other thing about the recognition is I was informed, it's been 2 weeks ago, that we made it big time. This exhibition is in the New York Times newspaper as part of their statewide cultural roundup of what's happening. New Yorker magazine as part of their statewide cultural roundup, what's going on in the States. And there's an article in the New York Times, it's been about 2 weeks ago now, in the New York Times by Texas Monthly author who wrote it for the New York Times. So we are in both the New York Times and New Yorker magazine, but not so far the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. We're still working on that. Did that sound bitter? It's not. Okay. Our first speaker today, the people you came to hear, is going to be Scott Barker. And Scott's going to be speaking on, as you can see here, a precarious profession, photographers in early Fort Worth. I didn't ask Scott or Quentin about it. I've never liked introductions. I don't like being introduced, and if sitting in an audience, most people don't want to hear, well, he graduated, and then he went to school, and then he did this, and then he did that. So all I will say to you about Scott is I've known Scott about 15 years. I met him when he signed up for, willingly or knowingly or otherwise, signed up for a Fort Worth history class I was teaching at TCU back in 97 and 98. And he was a member of that class, which I consider, a lot of my contacts, people I know in Fort Worth, first came together, got to know me and got to know each other at that TCU history Fort Worth class back in 1998. Scott has gone on to become the go-to person in terms of Fort Worth art. He knows the artists, he knows their story, he knows the art. I just remembered back when we did when we were going to do the Kennedy exhibition coming up in the fall. Scott either did that on his own or was a central person in trying to reassemble the art that was put up in the Hotel Texas on John and Jackie Kennedy's visit here in 1963, and trying to reassemble that art and what it was is amazing. This is what Scott does. He also helps spend hours putting up exhibition photographs in the exhibition hall free after he gets off work late at night. So I want to introduce Scott Barker, and he'll be talking on this subject. Please welcome him.
Well, I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciate what Rick Seltzer and Donna Donnell have done to bring this exhibition together. This is a subject that should have been covered before now, but thank goodness we're doing it. The history of Fort Worth photographers is truly amazing and fascinating, and to my knowledge, it hasn't been seriously studied before, so this gave us all a chance to really think closely about what the photographic history of Fort Worth really means. So I really appreciate Rick and Donna for organizing the exhibit and giving the rest of us the inspiration to think about all this. A precarious profession, I think what I mean by that will kind of come clear as we proceed in the program. We have a marvelous photographic record here in Fort Worth. It allows us to do a lot of different things. For example, we can look up Main Street here about in the late 1890s from the courthouse, and we can look at the brand new Texas and Pacific passenger station We can use our photographic record to see our first post office being constructed. We can use it to go back and look at Fort Worth on a snowy day in the late 1890s and see what they were doing to have a little fun, and look at some of the folks that inhabited the city before we did. We can use this photographic record to ride the streetcar over the Jennings Avenue Viaduct into downtown from the south side. We're right over the TMP tracks here, and we're fixing to pass the Majestic Theater and the Carnegie Public Library's dead ahead. This is the kind of stuff that the photographic record lets us do, lets us understand our city much better. We don't always know who took these photographs. Sometimes we do. I'd say more often than not, we don't know anymore because the names are so easily separated, the photographer from his photograph. So one of the things I'm going to do today is I'm going to recount some of the names, and we're going to meet some of the people that created the photographic record that we have. Between 1875 and 1915, that's a 40-year span, so it doesn't seem that long, over 60 individuals and partnerships worked as photographers in Fort Worth. There wasn't a lot of money in it. The turnover rate was really high. Only a few remained in business more than a few years. And some of the names that I have listed here, Mr. Daniel, Mr. Leffler, the three Swartz brothers, Mr. Works, they were some of the ones that were able to remain in business. They kind of figured out how you make a little money doing this. And they were the more long-lived studios, but there was a whole raft of others that tried and didn't stay around very long. 6 women were among those who worked as professional photographers here between 1875 and 1915. Emma Lucor was the first one that opened a studio here under her own name, so she became our first professional lady photographer in Fort Worth. I'm going to throw a whole lot of names at you in a hurry. There are directories that have been published where most of these names are already listed and written down. The easiest one to find is Catching Shadows. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble, and it's a directory of 19th century Texas photographers. So most of the Fort Worth names are in there, not every single one, but most of them. You can spend a whole lot more money and get a really good book. This Biographies of Western Photographers has even more information. But there are a lot of published information already to at least give us a framework for understanding who these people were. Fort Worth's earliest photographic images are found in CDVs, cabinet cards, and stereo views. And you're going to say, well, what the heck is a CDV? Well, that's a short name for cartes de visite. This is a CDV, and you'll see it's about the size of a playing card, maybe even just a little bit slimmer than a playing card. And typically, it would have some kind of advertising on the back of it. Between the Civil War and the late 1870s, the CDV was the principal way in which you shared your photograph with other people, with other family members, business contacts. The cabinet card replaced the CDV in the mid-1870s, and then it was real popular for the rest of the century. And you can see it's a good deal larger. This is a horizontally printed CDV in the middle, and then we have, a cabinet card in the middle, and then we have a CDV at each end to kind of give you a comparison on the size. So the cabinet card was just bigger. You could print more visual information. The photographs were printed on thin paper, which is glued to a hard cardboard backing, so you didn't need them in a frame. They just stand up. You could stand them up on a mantle in your house. Also, some of Fort Worth's earliest visual information is captured in stereo views. Stereo views, whereas the name implies, were 2 photos that are taken from slightly different angles. You had to have a special viewer to see the 3D effect, and it's not so different from the way you have to do it even now. The very first photographer that we can really say we know what his work looked like was L.W. Crawford. Now, he was in business here by around 1875. We had photographers in Fort Worth prior to 1875. We know who they were, but we don't have any visual information about them. There are no surviving examples of Mr. Abernathy, for example, or Mr. Freeman, people like that. We have their names. We don't know what their work looked like. But we do know what L.W. Crawford's work looked like, and this is a CDV photograph. This is not Mr. Crawford. This is one of his portrait subjects taken about 1875, and this is the advertising that you would find on the back of this little L.W. Crawford photograph. And here's another one of his portrait photos from 1875. Let's read some of the information. Oops. He was doing business at the southeast corner of the public square. That's the courthouse square, so it was right across the street. He could come out and take landscape photographs. He'd photograph your herd of cattle and goats if you wanted, residences, stereo views. He'd make pictures of every style. He'd color them in paints and pastels. He'd do anything you wanted with a photograph. And this was typical. Photographers had to offer a full range of services, just like they still do. This is one more L.W. Crawford portrait photo from about 1875. Then about 1877, he partnered up with a man named Alonzo Wheeler and became Crawford and Wheeler. They did business at 7.5 Houston Street. That meant they were 7 doors south of the courthouse, upstairs. And that's where they officed. And then here's a couple of photographs, portrait photos made by Crawford and Wheeler about 1877. And I love this one of the little girl holding the apple in the homemade dress. This is the famous Daggett and Hatcher photo. It was taken about 1878 on Market Day in the courthouse square. We call it the Daggett and Hatcher photo because that was the name of the wholesale grocer that was in business there on the square back then. You can read the sign. There's at least one authoritative book that was published years ago by the Carter Museum that credits this photo to Crawford and Wheeler, and I think that's probably about right because this photo was taken at exactly the time they were here, and we know they were doing outdoor photography, so it probably is a Crawford and Wheeler photo. I expect that this one is as well. This is a different view of the square. You're looking at the newly constructed courthouse around 1877. But again, I'm pretty sure it's a Crawford and Wheeler photo, but the exact identification has been lost. But this has been reproduced many times. This is a stereo view of that same scene. And again, chances are Crawford and Wheeler took it, but their name's not on the back. There's a publisher's name on it, but not their name. 1877 also saw our first city directory published. As that sounds, that was a listing of businesses and individuals that did business here in 1877, and 3 photographers advertised that year. Crawford and Wheeler was one of them. Mr. Casey, R.H. Casey, whoops, let's back up. R.H. Casey advertised in 1877. He had a really cool phrase. He called himself the boss photographer of the West. Oh, I just love that. I've never seen an R.H. Casey photo, and hopefully somebody's got one in a collection, and we'll get a chance to photograph it sometime. The third man that was advertising in 1877, Thomas P. Day, had his photograph gallery, and he advertised himself as the only first-class establishment in the city. And I don't know what Crawford and Wheeler thought about that, but that's what Mr. Day said. So we're going to look at a couple of Thomas Day portrait photos that he took about 1877, and you can see the nice graphics on the backside. These, by the way, these blank CDVs were ordered from suppliers with the printing. They were customized for the business on the back, and you could choose what you wanted the fonts to look like and stuff like that. So the actual CDVs came from the East. And this is another T.P. Day photograph from about 1877 with a little bit different logo on the back. Charles Moak was here about 1880. He wasn't here too long. Mr. Moak did business at number 5 Houston Street, so he was 2 doors down, or 2 doors closer to the courthouse than Crawford and Wheeler. This is a CDV photograph. This is a cabinet card photograph he took of little Anna Tidball, and Anna's daddy was an early day Fort Worth banker here, who's fairly well documented in our history. You can read the advertising of Mr. Moak. He says, photographs in every style, best place in the city, Fort Worth, Texas. Augustus Mignon, about 1882, came along, founded a studio at 24 Main Street. He called it the Fort Worth Art Gallery. And this is typical of photographers back then. This was kind of for advertising reasons, they drew a real close parallel between visual art and photography. They were one and the same, or they wanted you to look at them that way. Because, you know, the West was vast and sparsely populated. There weren't that many real artists in the West back then, so photography filled that gap for portraits and things to decorate your home. And so there was this real tight bond between the idea of art and photos. So Mr. Mignon called himself the Fort Worth Art Gallery. These are 2 more Mignon photos from about 1882 taken here in Fort Worth. and one more. And you notice he's just using a rubber stamp. He didn't have all that fancy advertising from a supply house. He probably couldn't afford it, so he just had a rubber stamp made, and he just stamped the backs of his photographs. He's produced cabinet cards and CDVs both, so I have one of each of the Mignons here juxtaposed with each other. We know that Mr. Mignon took some outdoor photography. This is a photograph with his studio name on the back stamp. It's a Texas Pacific locomotive in the riverbed. The bridge is collapsed here, and so it probably happened somewhere nearby, close to town. He wouldn't have ventured too far away to take this picture. So we know that that Mignon did take outdoor photos, and although his name doesn't appear on as many as I think probably should. Joe's Gallery, about 1885. He was here so briefly that he's not picked up in any city directory, and none of the researchers that have studied this subject even know Joe's last name yet. So, but he was here long enough to leave us a bit of a record of his work. Joe's Gallery on Houston between 6th and 7th, next to Gillespie's office. By 1885, two what I consider heavyweights finally came to town. David Swartz and Gustav Rhine set up shop at about the same time. Both of these men stayed in business in Fort Worth for quite a number of years, and we're going to talk about David Swartz first. David was from Virginia. He was from a family with 10 other siblings, or 11 of them altogether. He arrived in Texas about 1880 and worked as a traveling photographer. He also lived down around Columbus, Texas for about 3 years before he came here and arrived here in 1885 to set up his studio. His first location was, we'll look down here, 1013 Main Street. That was right in the middle of the red light district. And that's probably where the rent was the cheapest. So that's what David Swartz could afford. He set up business when he came here as the Lone Star Copying House at 1013 Main. And you'll notice down here it says D.H. Swartz and Brother Proprietors. His brother John joined him here late that year to apprentice and learn the trade from his older brother David Swartz. Shortly after, they moved about 6 blocks north to 600 Main Street and changed the name to the Cottage Gallery. So we'll look at a few of the portrait photographs that David Swartz produced around, this is 1885, 1886, when these would have been done at the old Cottage Gallery. These are 2 of the back marks, very elaborate. David Swartz spent lots of money on advertising. He liked to advertise in the paper, the city directory. He liked to put elaborate advertising on the backs of the cabinet cards to tell us all about himself. I like this one over here. It says, the only studio in the state that takes pictures after night by electric light. So that's telling us that by 1885 or 6 or 7, a lot of studios didn't even have electricity yet. So you had to have your picture taken in the daytime. We'll look at a couple more of the portrait photos from the Cottage Gallery. These are both beautifully composed, as are these. You see how nicely everybody dressed? You used to dress up to go to the photographer because they had the equipment and you didn't, so it was a special occasion to have your picture taken. Then the logos begin to change. The name Cottage Gallery now is gone. And finally, he moves over about a block west to Houston and 5th. His address became 600 Houston Street. He did business over there as the Swartz Art Parlor. So there's that art connection again, like Mr. Mignon was doing. And again, David Swartz advertised heavily. This is one of his ads from the city directory about 1887. You can see he had a big bushy whiskers. And we don't really have a good photograph of David, but we do know generally what he looks like from these kinds of graphic illustrations that appeared in his advertising. Now this logo, if you'll notice, he's still at 5th and Houston, Swartz Art Parlor, but it doesn't say D.H. Swartz and Brother anymore. That's because John Swartz leaves the partnership, or the training period was over, we'll put it that way. You notice this just says D.H. Swartz, there's no Brother at 600 Houston Street. By about 1888, John Swartz was finished his apprenticeship with David, and rather than compete head-to-head, with David Swartz. John Swartz moved up to the Sherman-Denison area and stayed up there for several years. And so occasionally you will see a cabinet card photograph. In this case, it says Swartz and Freeman, and it has a Denison, Texas address. Well, that's John Swartz. He'd done his training, he left town, he went north, but he will be back. Before he left in 1888, he took this very well-known view of downtown Fort Worth from the courthouse square looking east. So this is Belknap on your left, Weatherford Street on your right. We're looking directly east toward Dallas. And John Swartz's name is on it and the date down here at the bottom. And you can see that even by 1888, Fort Worth was not a very glamorous place at all. It was still very much a rough and tumble town. Gustav Rhine, he was the main competition of David Swartz in the early days. Mr. Rhine set up as a photographer of both portraits and outdoor views. And we'll look at a couple of his portrait photographs from the old Gustav Rhine studio. Now in 1889, Gustav Rhine, most of y'all know the story of the Texas Spring Palace, but for those of you who don't, it was our first big tourist attraction. It was built in 1889. It was an official project of the Fort Worth and Denver Railway, and it was designed to attract immigration to the Texas Panhandle specifically. The theme of the palace was Texas agriculture, and it was this gigantic wooden building, and counties all over Texas were asked to come in and stake out little spots within the palace and bring examples of the agriculture of their county. And so that was the whole theme of it, and it was right down by the railroad tracks, so it was easy access. So the Texas Spring Palace became a huge hit attendance-wise in 1889, and so Gustav Rhine was the official photographer of the palace. So we're going to go inside here for just a minute and look around. This is a Gustav Rhine 1889 photograph inside the Spring Palace of some of the displays that were set up inside. You notice the lighting in there wasn't very good. It was kind of dim. Everything is covered with straw and grains, and it's hanging down everywhere. We're kind of underneath that big dome here, I think, that was in the center of the building. There was a band loft inside the Spring Palace, and for the 2 seasons that it was open in 1889 and 1890, the Elgin Watch Company sent the Elgin Watch Company band down here during the spring for the few weeks that the palace was here open. And so the band, we see them in the band loft. They were a very popular attraction there. Now you see all this stuff though, this dangly stuff hanging down everywhere. That's going to cause a problem here in a little while. So we're going to come back to that. So David Swartz, not to be outdone by Gustav Rhine being the official photographer, in 1889, David Swartz produced our very first photographic view book called Photographs of Fort Worth. He went and photographed all the major buildings, all the major churches, many of the major homes, the finest homes in town. He kind of published them on these composition pages where you'd have multiple images on each page. For example, this is the Board of Trade, which was at Houston and 7th Street, and there was an observation deck up here on the top where you could go kind of get this bird's eye view of the city. He had the churches in there. He had some of the bridges that were leading in and out over the Trinity in there. This is a real interesting David Swartz photo from 1889, and he's on top of that Board of Trade looking to the northeast, so that's the Tarrant County Courthouse. That's the old Commercial Club, which was at Main and 6th. And then if you did a 180 and just looked the other way in 1889, you would have seen the palace down there on the south side, down by the train tracks. And kind of looking like space aliens had sort of dropped it in. You know, it was just so unusual, such an unusual place. But David Swartz probably took this one, but we really don't know who took it. Interestingly, in the 1889 Swartz View Book, there is an artist's rendering of the Spring Palace, but no photograph of the Spring Palace. And I've always found that real curious. I don't know if he was not allowed to publish a photograph of the palace or if it just wasn't finished yet when he published the book. So there's an artist rendering in David Swartz's 1889 View Book of the palace, but not an actual photograph of it. John A. Blair was in business in the mid-1880s. He was here just a year or two. But long enough to produce this really marvelous image of a downtown street in the middle of a snowstorm. So this is John Blair, 1888, and this is an unpublished image, and it's available to us today by the generosity of its owner, who's allowed us to get a look at this. This is a non-published photograph of Fort Worth, and we think there are probably a lot more of them out there. Richard and Kaiser came along about the time Mr. Blair did. It was Mr. Frank Kaiser and Jules Richard, and they did business as the Richard and Kaiser Art Photography Studio and also as the Southern Art Gallery on Main Street. They weren't here too long. This is an advertisement that they ran in the city directory one year. Jules Richard, late of the Académie des Beaux-Arts of Paris, France, has done the most artistic and finest portrait work in Fort Worth and other leading cities of the state. He could photograph you or he could paint you freehand, so he offered the chance to have your portrait painted by an artist if you wanted to pay him to do that. Around 1888, about the time Richard and Kaiser were here, John G. Brittingham and Clifford Sawyer partnered up in this firm called Brittingham and Sawyer. They were in business for 2 or 3 years. They did business at 808 Main Street. They were primarily portrait photographers. So I'm going to show you a real quick series of Brittingham and Sawyer portrait photos. And you see their logo on the bottom. The next firm that came along was Lucor and Ward. They were here about the same time as Brittingham and Sawyer. This is Mrs. Emma Lucor and Gurney Ward. And if you read the back of their cabinet cards, their advertising indicates that they were from New York City. Came here about 1888. They offered again a full line of services. And they were located next to the Fort Worth Opera House, which is on Rusk, which is Commerce Street today. And they were right around the corner on 109 East 3rd Street. They were just right around the corner from the Opera House, so they called themselves the Opera Studio. They offered cabinet cards as Lucor and Ward Opera Studio. And then they also had this kind of an unusual size photograph called the Operette. This was a souvenir view of the state capitol in May 16, 1888, taken by Lucor and Ward. And you can see again their logo there on the left of the cabinet card. This was a souvenir. They produced these and sold them as souvenirs for collectors. This was the little operette size, and this was even skinnier than a CDV. It was about a 1/4 of an inch skinnier, and they could sell it really, really cheap. So that was kind of the trick, is the cheaper you could sell your photography, the better, to try to compete with all these other people. This is the old Opera House that they were almost right next door to, which gave rise to the name of the studio. They then moved, Lucor and Ward moved to 808 Main Street and changed the back of their cabinet card to reflect the difference. And if that address may sound just a little bit familiar, that's because that was Brittingham and Sawyer's address, 808 Main. So Lucor and Ward acquired Brittingham and Sawyer, and so Mr. Sawyer and John G. Brittingham moved on. Don't know where they went, not sure. Then Mrs. Lucor went out on her own, and this is when she became our first female professional. And she did business for probably at least 3 or 4 years as Mrs. Emma Lucor on Throckmorton Street. There's a fairly substantial body of her work still around, so we can get an idea of what Mrs. Lucor was doing. And these are 2 more Emma Lucor photos, probably right around 1890 when these were taken in Fort Worth. Joseph E. Daniel was in business also by the late 1880s. He's one of the guys that stuck around a while. He was a fierce competitor. Mr. Daniel did business at 610 Houston Street. These are some portrait photographs by him. I love this one. These are some pretty rough-looking guys. And, you know, if they had guns, I wouldn't have been surprised, you know, who these people were. I don't know who they were because their names are not written on the photographs. 2 more really nice J.E. Daniel portraits from probably the early 1890s when these were taken. These are 2 Hispanic men taken, photographed by J.E. Daniel. You don't see Hispanics in the photographic record very often in Fort Worth, and their names are written on the backs of the photos, so it was really easy. In fact, I think I wrote it down. Yeah, on the left, Ramon Lopez, and on the right, Cesario Espinosa. We know Mr. Daniel also took outdoor photographs. This is the horse fountain, which is down on the courthouse square, the old watering station, which is today they're reconstructed for us to still enjoy as it looked in the 1890s. And this is a digitally enhanced black and white photograph of the horse fountain. And you can see the horses watering there. Mr. Daniel took a picture of it, and then he produced a cabinet card. So this is on a cabinet card, and then he would sell that for a souvenir of the city. Now, you remember all that dangly stuff, you know, hanging down in the Spring Palace. Well, on May the 30th, 1890, which was the next to the last day of the second season of the Spring Palace caught on fire. It turned out this was probably the most flammable building ever constructed in the history of Tarrant County. So the Spring Palace caught fire that night of May the 30th. It burned very quickly. There are no photographs of this fire because it happened late at night. It happened quick. The Spring Palace burned in 15 minutes. So there are only artist renderings of what that conflagration looked like. We had a local bootmaker here named Orrin McCormick. He was a pretty good amateur painter, and Mr. McCormick did a painting of the Spring Palace on fire. And man, you could see people coming out of there like fire ants. I mean, they were just really coming out of there. And miraculously, there were actually several thousand people in the building when it caught on fire, and it burned so fast. There were lots of bruises, lots of broken bones, burns, you know, minor burns, only one fatality. So it was just an absolute miracle that only one person was injured so badly that they died a few hours after the fire. Mr. Daniel bought the rights to Orrin McCormick's painting here, and he produced it as a souvenir cabinet card photograph. So it's recorded that many images of the Spring Palace fire were decorating Fort Worth homes for a long time. The people that remembered that wanted a souvenir of it. Mr. Daniel also went as far west as Weatherford, Texas, to look for business. This wasn't unusual. Texas photographers back then were usually willing to travel if they had to find the work because it was so competitive. William R. Works was in business by 1890. He's another one that stayed in business quite a while. He started out as the People's Gallery. Then he went into business under his own name, just Works. So there's a lot of Mr. Works' photography still around, still in circulation in local collections today. I like these. These are just kind of fun photos. He did this in the studio, the lady in a snowstorm. And I think this is his wife, but I'm not absolutely sure. And a real nice photo by Mr. Works of a young couple, newlywed couple. He partnered for a little while with a man named Ernst Kruger, a German man who came through town. Mr. Kruger wasn't here very long, but for the time he was here, he had a very distinctive style as portrait photographs. You can pick out the Ernst Kruger style. They have a certain kind of tone and finish. They're real highly finished photographs, and they've held up real well over time. So these Works and Kruger photos look almost as beautiful today as they did 120 years ago when they were first made. Then Mr. Kruger left, and so Mr. Works just dropped the Kruger name and went back to what he'd been before. He was partnered with other people at one time or another. And these are two early 20th century photographs by William Works. He was doing business as the Works Art Gallery at that stage. Frank Loeffler, one of my favorite early Fort Worth photographers, opened for business at 600 Houston Street about 1894. Now, if that address sounds familiar, that's because that was David Swartz's address, was 600 Houston. So what happened was Frank Loeffler moved into David Swartz's old place, and Mr. Swartz moved over to the Hurley building, which was our newest, plushest commercial address at the time. It was Fort Worth's first skyscraper. And David Swartz moved over there to the Hurley building in 1894, and Frank Loeffler moved into the old Swartz place. Loeffler was in business here at least until World War I, so he had a long and colorful career as a photographer. He was a very artistic man. He was very careful with his posing and his lighting and his setups, and I'll show you several examples of that. This is a late 19th century cabinet card photograph by Frank Loeffler. When he first started out, he was actually partnered up with James Thomason, and I don't know a lot about Mr. Thomason, but Loeffler wasn't in partnership too awfully long. This was the back mark on one of the Frank Loeffler, Thomason and Loeffler cabinet card photographs. And he had a very ornate back mark on his cabinet cards also. So he believed in that advertising, that advertising value that you could get out of printing on the back. One thing I like about Loeffler is a lot of times he'd like to have his sitters doing something. In this case, you can see the gentleman, he's got his hand on the dog, and in this case, the young lady has her hand on the pole, so she's doing something. So it makes the photograph just a little bit more interesting. Then Mr. Thomason left, and Frank had it all to himself. He had a prop box, and I've seen a lot of examples of he would dress his people up. It was kind of like an early version of glamour shots, you know, it's kind of like that. And so here he's got these 4 young guys probably in here on a Saturday morning, and they're downtown having fun. And then he puts the hats on them. Oops. That's without. And that's with, okay. These are also props. The reason I know that, this wrap and these hats and these stoles that these young ladies are wearing, I've seen these used on other sitters in other photos, so I know Frank Loeffler just kept them on hand. They were like props to him, but I just love the pose of the 5 women. He took a lot of time setting this up. He could have just sat 3 of them in a chair and 2 behind, you know, and that would have been the standard way to do it, but he took a lot of time with this beautiful pyramidal arrangement of the sitters. And here's a larger group by Frank Loeffler, late 1890s. He always, again, the lighting is perfect in a Frank Loeffler photo, the pose is perfect in a Frank Loeffler photo. There's nothing quick and dirty about a Frank Loeffler photograph, so I guess that's one reason why I really like his work so much. One of his slogans, his advertising slogans, was "Let me use your face," and so, but at least he kind of knew what to do with it, you know. So, Charles Swartz. Let's talk about the great Charlie Swartz. Charles Swartz is responsible for a large slice of our understanding of turn-of-the-century Fort Worth and what it looked like. And he was what he called himself a view photographer, or that means he specialized in outdoor views, not so much indoor portraits like what we've been seeing. Mr. Swartz trained with his brother, David. He came here about 1893. Charles apprenticed with David. He then specialized as an outdoor view photographer. It's a little bit murky. I think he actually worked side by side with David and John both for brief periods before he got his own permanent studio, so it's a little hard to puzzle all that out. But the thing about Charles Swartz is he loved to be where the action was. You know, he wanted to be right there. This is one of a series of photos he made of that famous Texas Pacific passenger station fire in 1904. There are actually 5 different angles that he shot the fire from, and this is one of the 5. He was real good in front of a crowd. He did lots and lots of these big crowd shots. This is the Butchers and Grocers Union in the late 1890s in front of the courthouse, so he knew how to get everybody still and paying attention so he could get the shot, you know, without getting it messed up. This is another one of Charles Swartz's outside group shots, and this is the old, it says Monday morning shipment from the Aeromotor Company, Branch House, Fort Worth, Texas. This was a distributor of windmills, and so he was asked to come down and photograph the workers at the windmill shop. This is the Bohemian. This was a magazine that published here. It was published by a literary society called our Literary Club of Bohemia. This was the summer number, 1900. And the man I work for, Greg Dow, had a copy of this magazine. And he said, you know, there's a lot of Charlie Swartz photos in this old Bohemian magazine. He said, you want to see them? I said, well, yeah. So Charles Swartz had photographed the flower parade that year. This was an annual Battle of the Flowers. It was kind of like an early day parade of the roses. And so we'd have all these decorated wagons decorated with flowers, and they'd be judged. And prizes awarded. They did the same thing down in San Antonio. So in this 1900 magazine, I'm going to show you just a couple of photographs from it that Charlie Swartz made of the flower parade that year. This was an entry by the fire department. This is real interesting. You know, they had the boiler all decorated up. And this was a prize winner. It said they won first prize in snowball decoration. And I guess that's all those kind of snowball-looking things. But now I'm going to show you a couple of similar photos of flower parades that are actually pulled from the negative. These are all halftone reproductions. But when you actually see a Charles Swartz photo pulled from the negative, you can see how beautifully detailed these photos really were. He really knew how to capture the detail of the thing in front of him. This is another year and another flower parade, but again, they're just gorgeous detail in these photos that are pulled from the negative. In 1901, Charles Swartz followed his brother David's footsteps in producing another view book. This is our second early view book of the city. He called it Photographers of Fort Worth, Texas, published by C.L. Swartz, 700 Houston Street. And in it are some of the most iconic images that we have of the city at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century. This is a widely reproduced bird's eye view of downtown Fort Worth, where Charles Swartz went up on top of the post office, where we had a weather station up there, so you could get up there on top. He's looking northeast toward the courthouse. The old Wheat building over on Main, City Hall right across the street. Here's the Carnegie Library. This is one of the views in that 1901 Charles Swartz view book. This image has been reproduced many times. He's at the TMP station. He's looking directly north on Main Street to the Tarrant County Courthouse. Again, this is 1901 Fort Worth. The new Carnegie Public Library was brand new in 1901 on 9th and Throckmorton Street. You see the streets are paved with dirt. Most of our downtown streets were still dirt streets back then. At the turn of the 20th century, in the City Hall across the way from the Carnegie Library. He captured all these views from the back of a bicycle. That was Charles Swartz's main mode of transportation, was a bicycle. He never had a motorized vehicle of any kind, and so as Rick has described to us earlier today, he was known for pedaling all over town with that camera slung over the back. It must have been very unwieldy, but that's how he did it. John Swartz, the man who had been away in Sherman Denison, came back here about 1896 and opened a studio under his own name at 705 Main Street. John Swartz was primarily an indoor photographer, a portrait photographer. That's what he specialized in. So I'll show you a few of these beautiful John Swartz portraits. Here they are. Here are the Humphrey boys. I didn't know who these guys were when I bought this cabinet card. I just loved the image and the composition. And Donna Donnell is the one who puzzled out who these young boys were and what became of them. So these are the kinds of people that came through John Swartz's studio, and he sure knew what to do with them when they came in. I love this one too. This would be kind of high fashion in the late 1890s here. These are more early 20th century pictures by John Swartz. And the later pictures, he was in business here until about World War I, and you can really see this change in the way people looked and the way they dressed in some of the later John Swartz photographs. Now, on November 21st, 1901, John Swartz won the World Series, won the Super Bowl, Triple Crown all at once. And that was the day that these guys walked in, and you've all heard this story before. The Wild Bunch. This is when Harry Longabaugh, who was known as the Sundance Kid, Robert Leroy Parker, who was Butch Cassidy, and these guys were basically the brain trust of the biggest, baddest bunch of train robbers and bank robbers the West had ever known. They were hiding out in Texas at the time. They had come down from Wyoming because the law was after them. They were hiding out in Fort Worth and San Antonio for a while. So on that day in 1901, they walked into John Swartz's studio to ask to get their picture taken. Now, I don't know if John Swartz knew exactly who they were at the time, but he took a lot of care with this photograph. It's beautifully set up, and he was so happy with it when it was finished. Of course, they're gone now, they've left, and he's so happy with it, he actually put it in the window down at street level where you entered the little doorway there to go upstairs. And a man from Pinkerton's detective agency came by, saw the photo, recognized one of the people in it. I think Harvey Logan is the one that was recognized. He had a nickname of Kid Curry. But anyway, this man knew one of these guys, so he got a copy. It didn't take him long to figure out who these 5 people were, so within a matter of months, there were wanted posters put out all over the West based on these John Swartz photos of the Wild Bunch. So this is what precipitated the demise of the gang. It forced Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to flee to Argentina and eventually to Bolivia, where they presumably met their fate. And all of this based on what John Swartz accomplished. I blew the photo up just a little bit so you could see the studio imprint down here by Harry Longabaugh's pants leg. So we got you, Harry. And all of this by a young guy from Virginia, a farm boy from Virginia who came to Texas to learn a new trade and use those new skills to make his way. He used a shutter to make his way into the history book. So I think that's pretty good for on John Swartz's behalf. Fort Worth photographers working at the turn of the 20th century. Omer Greer, he was in business for quite a while. This is an advertisement for Mr. Greer. This is 1900. And Mr. Daniels was advertising in that same publication. Louis A. Hinsdale ran the Metropolitan Art Studio on Main Street, and this is a Louis A. Hinsdale photograph from about 1905. Mrs. Larimer was another one of the ladies who ran a studio under her own name, along with Emma Lucor. She was one of these 6 ladies who were professional photographers here. Frank Simpson, he was in business for quite a while. This is circa 1905 Fort Worth photo by Frank Simpson. And I believe we've got George Bryant coming up. George M. Bryant, and we'll talk just another little bit about him in just a second. Mr. Bryant also partnered with Louis Hinsdale to do outdoor photography under the name Hinsdale and Bryant. And they also produced along with Charles Swartz, produced a significant body of work that depicted Fort Worth in the early 1900s. This is one of them. This is the old Majestic Theater shot about 1905 or so by Hinsdale and Bryant. What happened to some of the people that we talked about? Well, David Swartz moved to Dallas and reinvented himself as Dr. Swartz. This is an advertisement from the Dallas City Directory. He founded the Dr. Swartz Chemical Company, making soaps, perfumes, and toilet articles. And his experience mixing chemicals in the photography lab allowed him to do this. And so he reinvented himself again in Dallas. But he was no longer in the photography business after the late 1890s when he moved over there. Charles Swartz died on the job when hit by a train on October 6, 1905. As the headline says, trying to rescue a camera. He was down there photographing a business about 5 miles south of town, set his camera up next to the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad track, the Katy. There was no train in sight when he set the camera up. He was out there clearing some weeds, getting ready for the shot. He heard the whistle of a southbound train. He knew that if that camera was destroyed, he'd be out of business, so he went into a full sprint to try to rescue the camera, arrived at the camera at the same time as the train, and was struck and killed there. He died within an hour. So that was how Charles Swartz's career ended. John Swartz stayed in business on his own account until 1912, sold out to this man, George Bryant, who was a Fort Worth Star Telegram photographer. He didn't leave, though. He stayed here and worked for Mr. Bryant for several more years before eventually returning to the family homestead in Virginia. So the total time span the Swartzes were here was about 30 years in Fort Worth. Frank Kaiser, that man that was partnered with Jules Richard, he didn't stay in photography very long, but he did become assistant chief of the Fort Worth Fire Department in the days when that was mostly a volunteer organization. And Mr. Kaiser is buried here in Fort Worth. He died in 1929. Augustus Mignon, he's the gentleman that photographed that TNP locomotive in the river. By the mid-1880s, he had gone into the confectionery business. He founded the Capira Candy Company, and later on the Fort Worth Cracker Company. So Mr. Mignon figured out that our appetite for sugar and salt was more lucrative than photographing us eating the sugar and salt. So There's actually a photo of his home. This was taken back in the 1980s when Carol Roark and her team were doing our historic resources survey. The Augustus Mignon home on East First was photographed before it was torn down, so at least we have a record of where Mr. Mignon lived. Thomas P. Day, he was one of those gentlemen that was in that first city directory in 1877. Mr. Day became a successful Fort Worth merchant. This is an advertisement out of one of our city directories. He did business at 414 Houston Street. He sold and repaired sewing machines, bicycles, lawnmowers, and he was also a locksmith and a gunsmith. And thanks to Mr. Day's extended family, he still has family in the area. We can go inside that bike shop for just a second and look around here at 414 Houston, where Mr. Day, this is Mr. Day right here with the gentleman with the beard. He had the bikes down one side and the sewing machines down the other. So he had a long career as a merchant after he left the photography business. That's pretty much it. That's a snapshot of all these men and women, this extensive cast of characters that help create the photographic record that we have. Our next speaker, Quentin McGowan, is going to start right away, so y'all don't leave your seats too far. And but before you go, just as my way of introduction, I've always wondered how come Quentin knows so much. You know, the guy is just a walking encyclopedia of Fort Worth history. And I discovered that he actually posed for Emma Lucord in 1888. So Quentin's secret of success is he's just been here a lot longer than the rest of us. So thank y'all very much.
Thank you, Scott. Great work. Please don't get up and go anywhere because we're working on a tight schedule. If you can do a seventh inning stretch, that would be maybe kind of stand up and do that. If you absolutely have to run to the bathroom, go. But if you can stay, we're going to introduce Quentin here pretty quick and get this thing going. While you're unstretching and sitting down, I want to tell you a story that. What a long, strange journey it's been, a story that happened as we were putting up the exhibition. On Tuesday night, April 30th, we were putting up the photographs in the West Gallery. And we had several of us working there in the West Gallery putting up the photographs. And Scott was there kind of directing traffic. And if you ever put up photographs, we had a plumb line. And the plumb line was across the wall to try to center the photographs. And Scott Barker, who was our resident expert, said, we just do it about 3 feet, about 36 inches, 3 feet, make the plumb line above the wainscot or whatever, so that we can all center it. And so Rick grabs a stick and goes and marks it and puts the plumb line, starts putting photograph, and Scott comes back over and goes, Rick, that doesn't look like that's 3 feet. I said, oh yeah, it's right here. He said, that looks about 3 inches off. Well, I had used a metric stick instead of a yardstick. So it took us an extra 30 or 40 minutes to go replumb all those photographs and rehang them because Rick the idiot was using a metric stick. So that was one of the adventures. It makes a good story now. At the time, there were a lot of us pulling our hair out, including me, because we had to go back and redo stuff. Let me introduce Quentin McGowan. Quentin is an institution in Fort Worth, Dorian Gray apart from it. If you look at your program, it gives you the official background. He's an associate judge with the Tarrant County Probate Court. He's a member of actually he was the chair of the Fort Worth Historic and Cultural Landmarks Commission, and he's gone on from being the chair to becoming a landmark. So that's even better than being the chair of the Landmark Commission. He teaches a course once a year, once a semester at TCU. Every semester he teaches a course at TCU through the Continuing Education Department on Fort Worth history. And that is the only history of Fort Worth course available now. I mentioned a while ago that I taught a course 13, 14 years ago, and that was it. So the only course that's available for anybody, old, young, middle, or whatever, on Fort Worth history is taught by Quentin now. All that's, and he's published a book, and he's one of those go-to people on Fort Worth history. I just want to give you the personal insight. I've known Quentin, I was trying to figure, about 30 years, although he didn't know me. First time I saw Quentin, he was in a production of The Fantastics, back when the theater, the Stage West was downtown. And again, I get to tell tales because I got the microphone, but Quentin, if you've ever seen The Fantastics, Quentin played the boy. Weren't you? He was the boy in The Fantastics. Now he could play El Gallo or anything, but he played the boy. And I remember at the time I fell in love with The Fantastics. It's still one of my favorite musicals. And as I got to know Quentin later, I found out he was far more than an actor. Historian, judge, many things. So without me rambling on and taking up more time, I'll turn it over to Quentin McGowan to do the next talk.
Handed me that cabinet card. It's really astonishing. I keep it sitting in my office, and I just asked Scott if the card had aged any in the time he's owned it. But it's kind of an amazing thing. And after Scott's talk, I don't have anything else to add, so we can just kind of cut straight to the questions. But I mean, that was amazing. I mean, the collection that Scott has put together, the variety of the artists themselves, the variety of the views that they took. I started falling in love with the photographic images as a way to learn more about the documented history that we had. And it then led into a pretty deep obsession collecting postcard images of Fort Worth that also ended up in a book. But we can use those photographs, not just for the full view, but the details that are in there. And I'm going to try to briefly get through a handful of images, and then we wanted to have enough time so that if you had questions for Scott or for me, we'd have an opportunity to do that before we moved into the reception. Talking about a precarious profession, from a business standpoint, it certainly was. From a life and death standpoint, it certainly was, as we found out with Charlie. But my curiosity and what I hope to find, I'm going to stress this again at the end of this talk, the images are out there. Scott pointed out the 1877 City Directory, the first one that was published. We had 8 photographers listed in that directory that year. He had mentioned R.H. Casey, Sam Swayze, G.W. Ross, E.L. Reed, J.W. Hill, Mr. Day, the Crawford and Wheeler Partnership. What happened to all those works? Every now and then, one image might pop up that just excites all of us. And we know there were a series of fires. We know that probably the mother lode of historic images of Fort Worth probably burned up. But these images are out there. The private images that your grandparents took that are sitting in a trunk or a dresser drawer or in somebody's estate sale, always be on the lookout. We know those images are there. My great hope is that as we begin to digitize more collections around the country, that previously unknown images will have an opportunity to be identified and we can repatriate that history. But it's out there. Always be on the lookout for it and never let any of that disappear. At the end of this, we're going to talk about some of the repositories. There will always be a place to get those historic images. Don't ever feel like they need to get tossed in the trash. We can find a home for them all. And as we look again at things that disappear, going back to this this issue of particularly the stereo views. There is one magnificent collection housed over at the SMU, the Lawrence Jones collection, that includes several early images of Fort Worth. Now we know we had a photographer here at the time. It was an active military post. Adolphus Guna was a known daguerreotypist, photographer. We know he took images. We just don't have them. We don't have anything back that early. So our photographic history really begins in the 1870s, and not much prior to that, although photography certainly had been around for a lot longer. But what we have over in the Jones collection is a very rare image, I think the only image that I'm aware of the original city and county jail that sat just a couple of blocks east of the courthouse on Belknap Street. Again, as Scott pointed out, a stereo view taken from a slightly different angle so that when you put it in that viewer, you get this true-to-life, almost 3D image. But what I copied this one for is you look down on the right-hand corner and you can see how obsessive collectors can be. So that Mr. Jones's price on this card was $500. Certainly acknowledging the rarity of the image. I'm sure Scott's probably run up close to that amount on some of the things that you've collected. We all have at some crazy point in our life. There are people out there who realize the value and don't let go of them except very dearly. But they do get preserved that way, and they get into a collection, and now these collections are being digitized to be able to share with everybody else. The photographers here, actually, we don't know who the photographer is. As Scott pointed out in his talk, this may well have been Crawford and Wheeler. They were so active in Fort Worth at the time. But this was published by J.C. McCurdy in Boonville, Missouri, who published stereo views across the country, kind of a major publisher at the time. But again, probably done by a local photographer. But what images will also tell us kind of glimpses in time. And what I love looking for in these are what are the people doing on the corner? The gentleman standing up in the wagon as he's making the round off of Weatherford Street down to Belknap. Prior to the electrification of the streetcar system, you see still the mule-drawn streetcar coming up toward the courthouse. A little bit of detail down at the bottom of the old iron fence that surrounded the courthouse, and a tradition that went back to the original courthouse built in 1860. You had a fence around the courthouse because particularly during those trade days, you didn't need livestock moving in and up through the building, because that certainly happened. The Jesse Jones, the retail grocer there on the corner, one of the city's long-standing retailers at the time. He was in business in Fort Worth for 40 years. After he passed, his son took over the business and continued to run it there, but Mr. Jones served as mayor pro tem for a time. But just this snapshot, just a minute of time, somewhere close, I think, about 1880, prior to the 1889 electrification of the streetcars. But you can see shopkeepers out, you can see people moving in and out of the shops, wares out for display, just a very typical day of what was going on in the city at the time. Fort Worth in the early years, particularly the early part of the 20th century, was moving into a boom period of industrialization. And this image reminded me of one local Chamber of Commerce ad that ran for a little while that was just titled, "We're for Smoke." You know, that as Chicago and New York and London were all being choked, by the Industrial Revolution, Fort Worth recognized that smoke meant progress. It meant an industrial base. But this is an image looking west in toward downtown. You can see the tower of the Texas and Pacific Passenger Station built in 1900, with probably a T&P train coming out of town close to where the old Tower 55 intersection is today. You can see the steam blowing out of the front of the engine, and a pedestrian who's kind of walking here calmly through the middle of the yards. But as you look too over here, you can see engine after engine after engine lined up here across the Texas and Pacific engine building, the Roundhouse, which was lost in the fire in 1909. Because once that fire reached this great expanse of the T&P compound, it burned itself out. That great expanse hadn't been there, the fire probably would have jumped all of that, gotten into downtown, and with those good southwest breezes, could well have taken out a good part of Fort Worth. A fire, as Scott pointed out with the Spring Palace, is a major part of the city's history. But he also mentioned, and I hadn't known this until Scott mentioned it, that David Swartz moved into this building. This was the Hurley Building, built at the intersection of 7th and Main, at a time that intersection was becoming the commercial center. So the fact that Swartz moved into this kind of most important financial center of the city kind of indicates his stature and status as a businessman in town. The city's first skyscraper, 7 stories, had a massive building, opened in 1889, built by the Fort Worth Loan and Construction Company that also built the Texas Spring Palace. Or sadly, we know what happened to the Spring Palace in May of 1890. Well, in 1898, we lost the Hurley Building. I think what I love so much about, there we go. Finally. So much, of the fun of the photographs is when we have direct comparisons. That beautiful shot of the Hurley Building, this pioneering structure in the city that had such a short life. But when you mention David in there, was he still in the building in 98? And did he lose his photography studio? Had he moved on by that point?
Yeah, I think so.
But looking down the street, this is looking down 7th Street, here's that Board of Trade building that Scott mentioned on the corner of 7th and Houston. All the way down at the end was St. Paul's Methodist Church, where the electric building is today. The church was taken down to build the electric building. But as the Hurley building came down, they actually had to dynamite the rest of this building to clear the lot. Of course, what would be built on that, I think, Scott, you had an image of the Hoxie building that was built on the same site. They decided maybe 7 stories is too tall at that point, so they rebuilt it 5 stories. But the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, that was the original tenant in the Hurley building, stayed on that site at 7th and Houston, and then would eventually demolish the Hoxie building to build, in 1924, a new Farmers and Mechanics Bank that's just been beautifully restored at 7th and Main by XTO Energy. But the befores and afters and the looks at what happens to some of these structures. But as we look at planning and developing the history of the city, it's the photographic record that gives us so much information and lets us, from a historic preservation viewpoint, preserve historic streetscapes. This is the Main Street in Polytechnic, which was a separately incorporated city at the time, out directly across the street from Texas Wesleyan University. This is the block that includes Burge Hardware, right here on the corner. It was the old First State Bank of Polytechnic. Moving down had grocers, tailors. The big building down here on the end of the street was the SS Dillo store, the first commercial business that opened in the neighborhood. But as you look through, you can see the streetcar lines kind of rounding the corner off of Nashville or this is actually Avenue E and Nashville. The streetcar stopped for the college. This has moved on around and then took a right and headed down Vaughn Street to go all the way down to the Masonic Home and School, which was the farthest extent of the streetcar line at the time. But some of you may have been reading in the papers lately that the Highway Department is going to be redoing Rosedale. Now, we've already gone through the reconstruction from Forest Park all the way to 287, to Martin Luther King Jr. Freeway. The original Highway Department plan was to continue Rosedale as a 5-lane thoroughfare all the way out to 820. It would have involved removing all of the historic structures across the street from the university. And it was the use of images like this that let us preserve the history, work with the Highway Department so that their new plans call for maintaining the historic streetscape. And as they come back through and rebuild Rosedale, we don't lose any of the historic structures. And they're actually now incorporating into kiosks along the pathway next to the university all of these historic images so that there will be a permanent reminder of what the neighborhood looked like as the new street comes together. It still works for recent history. Now, this is an image taken in the 1970s, looking at that same spot. Scott had the drawing earlier of the old Fort Worth Opera House at 3rd and Rusk. This building here is where the Opera House stood. Of course, adjacent to it, you recognize the Knights of Pythias Castle, looking down to the Western Union building at a Sundance Square devoid of trees, kind of very, very different than what we're seeing today. But again, a document of a period in time, and it's what makes these photographs so valuable in telling us what was there, showing us the evolution of a city, the changes in use of buildings, and the change certainly in the lifestyle that comes along. Up to modern times. As we look now toward our mid-century modern architecture that's disappearing nearly as fast as we can identify it. But this was the old public health building that stood on on University Drive, where the new Botanical Research Institute of Texas is. This building was demolished to make way for a magnificent new headquarters for BRIT. But again, we will have the photographic record as the only thing to tell us what was there. But this also points out an issue that's relatively new in the history of photography. As we move toward digital photography, it's much easier for that to disappear. How often do we take a picture and we just delete it from the camera? We're reaching a point that we may not have the kind of permanent record, the cabinet card, the carte de visite, the massive 3-foot panoramics of major events going on in town that we can fall back on. So again, it's critical that as we look at what we're doing with our own photographs now, if we have things that we consider important and valuable, we need to figure out a way to preserve these digital records for the future because they are so easy now for us to lose and certainly to manipulate. I think we're all familiar with the pictures during Stalin's era. If somebody fell out of favor, they were simply wiped out of the image. It was a little harder to do that in the old days. Much easier to do today. So that trust factor that we have in historic photographs, I think we're going to have some challenges in the future as we move forward. But here's a Charlie Swartz image of Carl Schilder's birthday, his 40th birthday. But what this tells us, The birthday party was held down at Hermann Park, which was one of the great German gathering places. This was at the foot of Main Street, right at the bottom of the where Paddock Viaduct is today, and where the electric company plant is. And this great image shows us not only what people were wearing. I mean, there's several in here, holding a glass of beer, probably toasting Mr. Schilder's 40th birthday. You can see over here his supply wagon for his brewery and beer delivery company. But back behind it is the pavilion for Hermann Park. And there are not very many images of the facilities. So it's very often in the backgrounds of these great kind of group portraits that Charlie was noted for, we end up with an architectural history that we would have lost otherwise. But just a great gathering. But as Scott pointed out, Charlie was a master at huge crowds. And if you've ever stood and had somebody try to take a picture when you're in a giant crowd, it's like herding cats. It's a very difficult thing to do, to get everybody to look at the same place at the same time. No telling what Charlie was standing on, because the main entrance into Hermann, he's about at the main entrance. He may have gotten up on that main entry gate to take the shot. We don't know. But there's so much information in this photograph beyond the actual subject itself that these become so valuable to us. Of course, again, another look at the image of Charlie's shot of the TNP fire in December of 1904. So we talked earlier about when Theodore Roosevelt came to visit, and his visit was documented. He was originally supposed to speak from this building, but when he arrived a couple of months later, all of this building that was left was an empty shell. They'd already started cleaning it out and rebuilding it. So we ended up having to speak instead across the street from the freight office terminal. And Charlie took another picture that day. He was kind of turned around with thousands of people out gathering to see Roosevelt. But we'll come back to this one in a minute and look at some of the other details in this image. These historic photographs tell us what we were at a given point in time. Now, this was one of the promotional pieces for the 1924 Diamond Jubilee in Fort Worth, celebrating our 75th year after the founding as a fort. There are a lot of images of the 1936 centennial when we brought Sally Rand and her nude fan dancers to town to kind of make sure that we could get an audience packed in. And my thought initially was, well, things were really risque in the 30s. Well, this is a pretty risque image for 1924. But this was what we were promoting around the world. A fair maiden in boots and wearing very little else, with her 6-gun standing in the middle of Main Street with the courthouse, figuratively at her feet. Whatever it suggested, it meant come to Fort Worth, this is still a fun place. Even though our old Hell's Half Acre may not be what it once was. I love this image. But we'll talk again about some of the places that our images are found later, and I'll talk about that one again. We saw an image earlier of the courthouse. Again, these historic images let us understand the transitions of buildings. We have no existing or known photograph of the original 1860 courthouse. It stood until it burned in the summer of 1876. This is the courthouse that was built to replace it. But as you look at this image, again, taken on a market day, all the cotton bales, livestock all around the north side of the square. This is looking across toward the east side of the square. The big building up here was the old Masonic Lodge that dated back to the 1850s. First 2-story building in the city, still a major player in town, even though the Masons had moved a few blocks down on Main Street by this time. But we see so much in these original images. We can zero in enough, blow them up enough to find the details, to understand the businesses that were there, and very often fill in the gaps because businesses could close in between the time a city directory was published the prior year and the next one. And the photographs give us an opportunity to fill in those blanks. That original building that was completed about 1877 leaked so badly that by 1882 it was time to redo it, expand the space. The county was growing. So they took that old building and took off that old onion dome. And someone said this reminded them of a gorge sitting out in a garden somewhere. And did the new kind of French Revival mansard roof style, added a new room up top, kept the original part of the cupola and added a clock. But probably another market day. This could be a district court day. These could be jurors who've come in. We don't know exactly what was going on this day. But you can see how small and the wings of the building were at the time. Well, by the late 1880s, the county again was growing so fast, needed so much more space, that they added back onto the building on a couple of the wings on the west and the north side of the building. Now, this image was the subject of some great controversy for a while, because this was published in Charlie Swartz's Views of the City. And what it shows is, of course, the new wing that was added to the building back over here, and then you can see the cut in of, as he did the kind of photo mosaic in the building. But it also picked up this building, and there was some controversy as to what this really showed. Was this an early doctored photograph? Because as you know, there are a lot of people out there who believe that photographs are meant to be manipulated and that they're usually done for some political reason. What this ended up showing, as it turned out, as we all played with it, was this is an addition to the 1889, after that 1882 expansion of the courthouse. And this shows kind of a fuzzy version of the old jail that was on the opposite side of Belknap Street. And, again, the photograph helped us solve a puzzle, because this had been broken out and kind of taken out of context of Charlie's book for a time. And being able to put all of the pieces back together let us solve that puzzle. And Jack White finally conceded that it was not a doctored image and that this actually showed what it was supposed to be. Of course, this building was then demolished to make way for the magnificent courthouse we have today. This is an image taken about 1901, shortly after the courthouse was completed in 1895 and 1896. But again, as you look around, we see the remnants of a very vibrant courthouse square. Today we have one historic courthouse square building remaining, and its future is fairly uncertain at this point. So this lets us, again, reconstruct a period in time. But some of the more important images that are out there are the amateur images that weren't taken by the professional photographer. Now, this is a shot that was taken on a hot summer July day in 1901. Now, the photographer's name was Claude Barnaby, and a local family called me a few weeks ago. They were cleaning out their mother's house, getting ready to move her into a smaller place, and said, "We found this stack of old photographs. We don't know what they are and don't know what to do with them. Can you help?" Eventually, these will get into one of our local repositories. But had a picture of the original packing plant in the stockyards, a couple of other street scenes downtown, but this great image of the courthouse in summertime that kind of answered some long-standing puzzles. Of course, July 1901, no air conditioning. As you look at the courthouse today that went through a restoration in the 1980s, these little bird's eye windows, they pivoted on their sides. By the time the restoration came along in the 80s, they had been so sealed in, all of the original hardware gone, that we really didn't know how the windows worked. The center pivot windows in what used to be the old Court of Appeals up on the fourth floor of the building. But this is kind of the living operation of the courthouse, something we see very, very rarely in images, but taken by an amateur photographer who could then send, as you look at this card, this was a stock card. You could, once you took your film, you sent it back either to Kodak or several of the other film manufacturers. They would then mount them on these cards and send back your pieces. But again, very valuable documents coming just from the amateur photographers. My favorite pictures of the city are aerial photographs, because you can understand so much in a concentrated view. Now, this is taken probably about 1935. Here's where, at the south end of town, here's the old post office, the Texas and Pacific passenger station, the huge T&P warehouse, and all of the yards for the Texas and Pacific, and then everything that moves up. So it gives you an immediate understanding of the relationship of the railroad industry in Fort Worth and how dramatic and how enormous a presence it was in downtown. Looking up the Main Street spine, of course, down here in that corner, the Al Hain Monument in its original location. But what this really points out to us is how densely packed the city was for most of its life. As we look around Fort Worth today, of course, this entire area, 13 square blocks at the south end of downtown, was demolished in the 1960s to make way for our convention center. You see the primary financial core here at 7th and Main Street, the old medical arts building, the federal courthouse, the old post office building, City Hall, the Carnegie Library, and all of those things concentrated. But I think what is so amazing about these is you can look at an overlap after overlap after overlap of these historic aerial images and understand the growth and the evolution and the development of the city. But one of the earliest aerial photographs, again, goes back to David Swartz's 1890 view book of the city. And as Scott pointed out, this is taken from that observation deck of the old Board of Trade building, which when it went up in 1889 was the tallest building in the city. And of course, the Board of Trade did exactly what its name implies. It was the forerunner of the Chamber of Commerce. So what better way to show off everything that you had in your city than to build this great observation deck on the top of the building to go up and have this 360-degree view of all of the business opportunity that surrounded you. So that from that view, you certainly had the major mercantile operations going on in town, as Scott pointed out, the old commercial club building. But it also points out the transition that we were going through in the 1880s into the 1890s as we were moving away from frame structures, which of course burned very fast and very easily, into a much more substantial town built out of brick and mortar. Of course, that old courthouse, after its 1882 conversion, because this predates the current courthouse. But the aerial views, again, give you an opportunity to find so much information. Back to that other image of John Swartz's, but that very first image that I started with of the old city county jail, here it is right here. And we'd known about it from this image, we knew about it from the bird's eye views, the lithographs that are out there. But to actually have a photograph of the building that's focused on that building, to understand the architectural detail, the way it built and the way it was actually sited. And I have a theory too, looking at this image that was taken, now that we know, in 1886. I had tried to date it and gotten it to after post-1883 based on this sign on the building here that says Tippecanoe for malaria. Tippecanoe bitters were patented at the end of 1883 as an anti-malarial and as a cure for malaria. It didn't work worth squat. But we knew this couldn't have happened before 1883 with that advertisement on the building. But also up here in the space where it absolutely ought to be is this large building that I believe is a later industrial conversion of that old 1850s Masonic lodge and temple. It still bears some more research, but that tall building kind of stands and looks exactly the way the Masonic building would if it were converted into a barn and for other storage facilities. But again, these aerial views, and when you could get up on these taller buildings, as they continue to rise, we see more and more of these great panoramic views of the city. Another image taken from the opposite side of the courthouse, and we're going to look at some of the details in this. And I think this is taken later than that 1886 view of John Swartz. And I think we're a little bit higher up on the building, which tells me this is probably from the new courthouse as opposed to that older one. But it bears a lot more research. But we know this is from the top of the courthouse. And for those of you familiar with Fort Worth, looking down here, this is Houston Street, moving through these, between these two buildings, a wagon storage shed. Here's Bluff. This is Franklin Street that now runs, it's now the walking and the jogging path down to the river. But for most of its history, Franklin was one of the major thoroughfares to get out of downtown. You headed out of Franklin, out across through the Batter Cake Flats area, connecting with a bridge that went across the river just east of where the Henderson Street Bridge crosses today. And then you'd hit Courthouse Avenue that would become White Settlement Road that headed all the way out west. That was part of the original Fort Road from between Fort Worth and Fort Belknap. So what this gives us in this snapshot, I think about 1894, based on some corroborative information from the old Fort Worth City directories and the Sanborn fire insurance maps, is that we've got an area that Rick has done a fair amount of research on, and of the underworld that lived down in Batter Cake Flats. But among the other things that are in here, of course, we see lots of frame buildings and the residential nature of downtown outside that commercial core. But focusing in on some of the things that are in this image, if you're familiar right next to the county parking garage, a very historic stand of oak trees called the Steele's Tavern Oaks, that we consider to be the only thing still standing from the days that this was an active military post from 1849 to 53. They stood in front of this house for many years, but this is that little stand of oak trees that thankfully the county preserved when they built the new parking garage. But as you move down Bluff Street, it takes this little jog down an obscure little street called Throckmorton Alley. And what's interesting is that as the county built two enormous parking garages, they still followed these old lot lines, and one garage goes right here to this point and takes a turn at Throckmorton Alley, and the next parking garage picks up. So even today, you can stand and through the use of this photograph, understand what this period neighborhood looked like. Now, another important element in this image was right up here with this little house and a little tiny mound in the yard of that house. There's a close blow-up of that. This was called the old Frenchman's Well, and it was here from the days of the fort. And there's another image that I've included in my book of historic photographs taken looking down Taylor Street toward this house with another view. But to have, again, out of this huge shot with so much information, another thing that gives us proof and kind of a definitive location for the Frenchman's Well. It was demolished here in the 1920s when some major street work was done and moved for a time to the courthouse lawn and then dismantled from the courthouse lawn and moved over to a private residence on the west side. We have a hope, now that we are restoring the courthouse grounds to its original condition, that there may be an opportunity to get the Frenchman's Well back up closer toward the old fort site and the courthouse as a permanent and a reminder of those early period days. Another view looking back across the Battercake Flats, the bridge across the river, and then out into this broad area. The railroad tracks would be running back up and through this area, but somewhere down in this stand of trees would have been the hanging tree where Bewley and Crawford were hanged for their abolitionist activities in Fort Worth back in 1860. Long gone, all of this is about to disappear with the new bypass channel and the Trinity River Vision. So again, to have this image to pinpoint what was there, what it looked like, and the differences between these cultivated sections of land, many of which went back to the original Peters colonists' land grants in the area, and the areas that stayed wooded. Just a very interesting view of looking at the transition. Same photographer, same day, just wheeled the camera around just a little bit farther to the west, looking down Belknap Street here, Weatherford, looking across to the front of the storefronts, school building over here, and the broad view looking out along the Summit and Penn Street spine, where we had so many of the major residential structures being built at the time. Close up on the prototypical school of the late 19th century as we began to consolidate the school system and began to make the schools of a uniform construction. There was one just like this on the far east side of the courthouse. Looking down across at the commercial structures on the east side of the square. This is where the Tejas de Brazil is today, that took up the old Lusky space here on the corner. But this also points out a small part of Fort Worth history, the newspaper called the Tarrant County Citizen, which had been established in 1891, merged in 1896 with the Fort Worth Livestock Reporter. So it confirms the date of the image somewhere in that 1890, 94, 95, 96 period. It would shortly move out of that location, merge with the old Fort Worth Mail Telegram newspaper, and then fold shortly after that. But looking again back up toward the horizon of this same image, back to that thought, we're for smoke. Here's the smokestack of the Holly water plant that was built in 1892. So again, relatively new industrial thing, but that old steam-driven water pump producing a lot of smoke just heading down the river. There's a very famous photograph of downtown Fort Worth taken from one of the houses right up here along the Summit Penn Street, looking back in toward downtown. One of the prominent features in that other image is John Peter Smith's home, one of the biggest in the city at the time. But again, you look at this and it tells you how residential downtown was. You know, it was an easy walk for the bankers who were living here, and of course, for the rich people, they had their carriage houses and they could saddle up and move into town. But you can see the enormous scale of the first generation of the mansions that would be built along the Summit and Penn Street spine all the way up toward Thistle Hill and then the Summit and Pennsylvania intersection. So back to this, and kind of finishing up this part of the talk and looking back toward a precarious thing. There are a couple of things that struck me as really interesting in this image. Of course, we've got the fire itself, which is pretty fascinating. But what was in here, and I thought it was very interesting, the way Charlie Swartz framed in the center of the building the Al Hain Memorial. Al Hain was the one casualty of the Texas Spring Palace fire. Kind of remarkable, all those thousands of people trying to scramble out of the building. Only one person succumbed and died. It's now been relocated about a block south of its original location. But what really interests me about this are these two women down here. This is 1904. They're not dressed in 1904 clothes. Now, obviously, we've got everybody in town who could get there coming to witness the fire. But these are so out of character. Are they just in from the country and this is still the manner of clothing? Or was something else going on in town on that December day in 1904 that brought these women down in their pioneer bonnets and pioneer clothes? Because directly behind them are a bunch of other women in very typical 1904 clothes. Don't know. But it's that kind of detail that make these historic images so much fun. And then finally, in that image, what we see is somebody who has climbed a telephone pole or an electric pole. Either one was going to be dangerous. Sitting at the top of this, taking a photograph of the fire. I am hopeful that someday this particular view will turn up and we'll find out if this guy survived it. Was he working for Charlie? Will that turn up as one of his several views? Don't know, but this really goes to the precarious nature of photography in the city. I'd love to see what happened to that. But let me finish here real quickly, just with a discussion of where do we find them? Because I mentioned at the beginning this issue of digitization, which a lot of us have been dreaming about for years. These photographs are meant to be shared. The way we do that now is through these digital collections. Of course, locally, our mother lode of those is out at the University of Texas at Arlington Special Collections. They have the Star Telegram collection, which is the bulk of the photographic files that still existed. There's a tragic story that somewhere back in the late 50s, early 60s, a photo editor at the paper decided that they needed more room in the photo library and just dumped trays of negatives and glass plates into the dumpster. You'd think, there's even one story that another local photographer rescued several of those. I hope there are more that may get discovered. But the story of this is that we had probably thousands of images taken of the city. As time passes, we have fewer and fewer and fewer that we can actually put our hands on. So to have the collections at a place like UTA, where they can be preserved, managed, cataloged, and made available for research is vitally important. And what they have out there is not just the Star Telegram collection, but also the Jack White collection. Jack was a local public relations and ad man who worked over the years doing lots of campaigns and really got his interest back when the city had its centennial of incorporation in 1973, and one of the local banks asked him to reproduce some of the historic images for their promotional brochures for that centennial year. That got Jack into copying historic images all over the city. He did copy negatives for the Carter Museum, for private collections, for other banks, anybody that had them, any images he could find. Jack shepherded those beautifully for a lot of years. Before he passed away, he made that collection available to UTA. The W.D. Smith collection, one of the great photographers here from the 1930s all the way through the 50s, as the city was going through major changes. So just at UTA, we pretty much have the mother lode of local images, but an amazing collection here at the Fort Worth Public Library, or the Fort Worth Library. the Tarrant County Historical Society collection that dates back to some of the pioneer families. A lot of those images of the wagons and the carriages decorated with flowers come back to the Tarrant County Historical Society collection. And as Betty mentioned earlier, the City of Fort Worth archives. The city hasn't necessarily been a good steward of their departmental archives, and we've lost a lot of images, but what they are finding now are finding a new home where they can be preserved and taken care of. But there's several other smaller collections full of photographs. The North Fort Worth Historical Society, the university libraries, Museum of Science and History has a remarkable local history collection. And the Tarrant County Archives, it's recently moved into a new home and is now making more and more of its materials accessible now that it can be found. Pretty remarkable collection out at Tarrant County College Northeast, which was where Dwayne Gage, former chair of the Tarrant County Historical Commission, taught for many, many years. And as he gathered collections and gathered stories from the pioneer days, he made sure that there was a copy of all of that for the archives out at the college campus. Historic Fort Worth preserves the archives of the old Historic Preservation Council. So lots of places to go, local historical societies. But as Scott pointed out earlier, the cattle barns, estate sales, your family attic, the antique malls, they're out there. If you find them, save them. Because if you don't, eventually they're going to make it out of those bins and disappear for good. On the web, talking about Jack White's collection, we have a local architect, John Roberts, who's created the FortWorthArchitecture.com website, forum to talk about all things about local history and local architecture. But over the last several years, John and Jack worked together to put on the website, I don't know how many images are there now, maybe 1,500 images, each with a description that all of us who played with it tried to make as accurate as we could. The Portal to Texas History, coordinated by the University of North Texas, is now digitizing collections from all over the state of Texas. A lot of the images that Scott used, a lot that I used, I've gotten through the portal. The Tarrant County, Texas Gen website. Now, there's a Gen website for almost every county now in the United States. Great resource for local history findings. The American Memory Project with the Library of Congress, the National Archives digital photography collections, and commercial archives. That 1924 image of the girl promoting our Diamond Jubilee came from the Corbis images. Corbis purchased the old Bettman archive, which was the largest historic photograph archive in the country. So they're available. You know, they're commercially available, or they're available complimentary through some of the federal sites. And again, university libraries and state historical organizations. There are so many things coming online every day that if you have things that you're particularly interested in, when you have a chance, sit down at the computer, Google in, whatever you're looking for, digital, and see what might turn up, because it's just astonishing how much is being put on. The Fort Worth Library now is digitizing and making available on the website the local collection here, which is a great, great gift to anybody doing research. To supplement those, to prove what you're looking at, to double check yourself, the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps are a great resource. The Amon Carter Museum website of those great 19th century bird's eye view lithographs. Amazing resource to look at a city and compare that to the photographic record. And then, particularly for those of you interested in local history, you've probably all got this by now. We have a local collector named Pete Charlton who has collected, I think, every map known. Now he's done the Indian Territory, other states, but he's got one called the Lost Maps of Fort Worth, and on a single disc, you can search every map that's been made. An amazing and wonderful resource. So with that, I'll close. Here are some of the credits that Rick was talking about, but we've got, I think, a few minutes if there are any questions for Scott or for me or for Dr. Seltzer or for Donna. But I just looking at that exhibition, congratulations to Rick and Donna for pulling this together. And thank you to the Swartz family members for being here to be part of this.
Let's take 10 minutes for questions, and then if there's more questions beyond that, we can ask the two speakers if Scott will come up here also when we adjourn to the chapel room. So let me turn it over to them. Just if you'll raise your hand, direct your question to either Scott or Quentin, and I'll let them do the honors.
Rick?
Yes, I have a question. It concerns the image of happened in Daggett? And I don't know if it's 10 times, I've just seen it, in our reproductions, I guess. What's the provenance of it? Because do you think it was taken in Tarrant County?
There are several images of Daggett.
Yeah, are you talking about the one where he's really young, that's part of the?
No, the one, I guess he'd be middle-aged.
Probably the one that was used on the city seal.
Probably.
There's about 4 or 5 images. I did an article on Daggett and the images that was in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. And right now, without going back and looking at what I wrote, I can't remember what all the provenance, because there are about 5 or maybe 6 different images, from the very, very young image that's been fairly newly discovered to very well-known images of an older, much stockier man.
Well, it would have been the older one, that's why I was wondering if that was taken before. You said you knew there were photographers here.
I think so. Again, let me refer you to the Southwestern Historical Quarterly article, where I went into a lot of detail about the provenance on those particular images. Right now, I'm kind of caught unawares if they.
Well, thank you.
I'm sorry for more help.
But I think, as Scott pointed out, there are thousands of images, only a handful, we're lucky enough to have the identifying mark on them. And 2, there are so many generations of reproductions that, when there's an opportunity to find an original, that either had been presumed lost or been stuck, somewhere out of sight. Because again, we've looked at that John Swartz image looking east down Belknap and Weatherford for years, that cut off that area down below that had his name and the date on it. So, again, every time we find one, there's something new to discover.
Other questions, anybody? Yes.
Randy.
Oh, Randy.
Yes, I have a question about the profitability of this profession. That you said it was quite competitive, and I saw the street view scenes. There were 50 views for
50 views for 50 cents.
Yes. What would a typical cabinet card sell for back then, and maybe in relative terms today? What are they expensive?
I know the CDVs, you could get them for as cheap as 25 cents a dozen. So the cabinet card was probably $1 or less. It wouldn't have been very much.
I think that John Swartz, at the time he made the copy of the Wild Bunch in November 1901, he was advertising that you would get a dozen, let me see, I think it was a dozen shots for like $2 or $3, a dozen nice shots, which was more than this price, but still darn cheap.
Yeah, it was a volume business. You had to sell a lot of photographs to make it each month. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And 2, another avenue of income, because there's several Swartz images that were then turned into postcards. As postcards came into play in the latter part of the 19th century, there was at least one more avenue, and there's some shots of interiors of the local drugstores, with the racks, and the pictures are tight enough that you can actually recognize some of the Swartz images, all of these picture postcard views of the city. But that can't have earned a lot more either, because they were penny postcards.
That was a major way of trying to make money off of a profession that didn't pay too much, is number 1, producing those postcards to sell, and number 2, doing shots for industrialists. Like when Charlie went out to shoot the shot out there, I'm sure he was paid probably more than, I would guess, maybe more than he was paid by somebody wandering in the studio and saying, how much for a shot, Charlie? So the commercial stuff and the postcards, I think, would be a major source of trying to make income off the profession. It did not pay very much. What else? Who else? Donna.
I just wondered if the 2 women photographers were widows or if they were married. Do we know?
I don't know. There were at least 6 of them, I know that, and I've wondered that too, because when Ms. Lucart came here, she was partnered with a man named Gurney Ward, so they didn't share the same last name, but they may have been man and wife. But, and the same way with Sarah Larimer and some of the others. So it's one of those areas that would really be fun to research, and I hope to be able to look into that sometime myself. Yeah.
It's an interesting field. Minorities in Fort Worth, and that's not just racial or ethnic, that's gender minority, have been so forgotten and overlooked in Fort Worth history. And we know 1 or 2 women in Fort Worth history, Burchell, and 1 or 2 others we can name. We assume they did everything. We can name Bill McDonald and about 1 or 2 other African-American Fort Worthers. We're doing well to name 1 Hispanic Fort Worther from before anyway, and we think that was it, the beginning and the end. And an area of Fort Worth history that needs a hell of a lot more work is these people. I had no idea about the women photographers. They were obviously professionals, whether they're married or widowed or whatever, they were running a business. That's very rare and unknown in Fort Worth history. And if you're from another city, I think you'll find the same thing. Most of our history, written of our cities, for the last several generations, focuses upon just the white middle-class people, because that was the ones who wrote the history, read the history, bought the history, and the others tend to get forgotten.
Yeah, they do.
What else?
Scott, you had a number of images of African Americans. Where did you find these?
There aren't a lot of those. One that I found one year at a book and postcard sale was taken by Mr. Daniel of a real well-dressed young African American man. And then Donna Donnell turned up the one that's on the gentleman and the young lady that are on display. Donna Donnell found those. I don't know where Donna found them. Donna, are you still?
One was
Yeah.
from Tom Wiederhoek with the North Fort Worth Historical Society.
Okay.
The other one is Jane Jones.
Jane Jones bought
Jane
it.
Jones. Oh, that's right. Jane Jones
Bought it
found
on
one on
eBay.
eBay. Yeah, one of them turned up on
Right.
eBay about 2
Yes,
years
yeah.
ago. And so for those of us who look for that material, you sort of troll everywhere where you might find one. And I remember that one of the real well-dressed African-American men, the bidding on that got real competitive because there were a lot of people that wanted that photo, and Jane Jones got it.
Yeah,
My goodness.
it went high. I loved it.
Another question? If you have more questions, here's the program. We're going to adjourn next door to the chapel room and eat and drink.
And the gallery.
And the gallery. Well, hang on. To the chapel room, eat, drink, and be merry, and talk to Scott and Quentin and ask questions. In about 15 minutes, if you want to do a guided tour of the gallery, about 20, 30-minute guided tour, I'll be standing at the entrance to the chapel room, and if you want to go along, just come out and be ready to go. I would say leave your food and drink here, but just meet me at the entrance. In the chapel room, go out here, look around the corner, and in the next door. Betty, anything else?
Thank you to Mr. Venable for
Yes,
being
thank
on.
you.
Oh, yes, yes.
My pleasure. Thank you.